Japanese goods will now be facing tariffs of some 15%. That's instead of the 25%.
President Donald Trump has announced a trade deal with Japan that he said will result in Japan investing $550 billion into the United States.
U.S. President Donald Trump says the U.S. has reached a trade deal with Japan. Trump says the agreement will see Japan invest $550 billion.
What happens when the most powerful man in America announces the biggest deal in history? And just weeks later, the world watches it burn. In the summer of 2025, Donald Trump walked onto the White House lawn, beaming with triumph. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled, and he called it the greatest trade deal ever made. Japan, he declared, would pour $550 billion into the United States, a number so big it echoed through every newsroom across the planet. Tariffs slashed, industries revived, jobs promised by the hundreds of thousands. It was supposed to be a new era of American dominance, proof that Washington could still command its allies and dictate the global game. But as the world applauded, Tokyo was already hesitating. Behind closed doors, Japan's officials whispered about something America hadn't considered: control. Who would truly decide how that $550 billion would be spent? And what did Japan actually gain from handing over its money to Washington's hands? Then, in a moment that stunned both Wall Street and the White House, Japan said no. On live television, its new prime minister tore the deal apart, calling it a threat to our national interest. The cameras that once captured a celebration now filmed a rupture, one that would shake the Pacific, rattle the markets, and challenge the very idea of American supremacy. Because this wasn't just a trade collapse, it was the first tremor of something far bigger, a silent rebellion rising from the east. And it all began with one word from Tokyo: no. It was a picture of power, the kind that history books are made of. Donald Trump, surrounded by America's industrial titans, stood on the White House lawn with a grin carved by confidence. Flags rippled behind him. Cameras zoomed in. This, he said, was the greatest trade victory in modern history. The numbers sounded unreal. $550 billion in Japanese investment to flow directly into American industries, from shipyards in Texas to semiconductor plants in the Midwest. Tariffs on Japanese cars would drop from 27.5% to 15%. America, he declared, would pocket 90% of the profits. It was more than economics. It was symbolism, the rebirth of American manufacturing, the proof that tariffs could force even its closest allies to bow. For Trump, this wasn't just a deal. It was a message to the world. The United States still wrote the rules. Wall Street rallied. Reporters hailed it as a historic pivot, and the phrase "deal of the century" began trending across global headlines. But beneath the celebration, unease rippled through Tokyo. Inside Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party, ministers whispered that the framework was dangerously one-sided, a handshake dressed as a treaty with no legal safeguards. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, cornered by months of tariff threats, signed it under pressure. In public, the smiles stayed. In private, resentment grew. Because deep down, Japan's leadership knew what Washington didn't. No empire, however powerful, could demand loyalty without respect. And when Ishiba's approval collapsed to historic lows, Japan prepared for a change no one in Washington saw coming. A change that would turn America's greatest deal into its greatest humiliation. The celebration didn't last long. Barely weeks after the cameras stopped flashing, Tokyo made a move that stunned Washington. On national television, Japan's new leadership announced that the $550 billion framework would be suspended indefinitely. The Prime Minister's tone was calm, almost surgical, but her words carried the weight of an earthquake. Any agreement that threatens Japan's national interest will be reviewed. The world watched in silence. The very deal once hailed as a monument to cooperation was now unraveling in real time. Within hours, markets wobbled, the yen fluctuated, and analysts rushed to understand what had just happened. According to Reuters, Japan's finance ministry formally declined to transfer any funds until the United States agreed to shared control over how the money would be used. What seemed like a small technical dispute quickly became a question of principle. Who holds the power? In Washington, officials were taken by surprise. The White House expected Japan, a long-standing ally, to comply without hesitation. Instead, Tokyo's response signaled something far larger than a trade disagreement. It was a quiet message: partnership, not submission. Inside Japan, the move was celebrated as an act of balance and independence. In the words of one political commentator, it was less a rejection of America and more a reminder that alliances must stand on equality. But while Tokyo's statement restored pride at home, it also triggered ripples across the Pacific. South Korea, Taiwan, and even Singapore began to reevaluate their own economic frameworks with Washington. The deal that was meant to bind Asia closer was now pushing it further away. And in the corridors of power from Washington to Wall Street, one question echoed louder than ever. Had America just underestimated its most loyal ally? To understand Japan's sudden defiance, you have to look beyond the headlines. This wasn't about numbers or tariffs, it was about control. For months, Washington's version of the deal had left Tokyo uneasy. The agreement granted the United States near total discretion over where Japan's pledged funds would go. Billions were set to flow into American projects, shipyards, semiconductor factories, and energy terminals, all managed under US oversight. To Japan's policymakers, that meant something deeper: a loss of sovereignty in disguise. As one senior official quietly told Nikkei Asia, money without decision power is not partnership, it's dependency. Inside Tokyo's political circles, pressure began to mount. Business leaders warned that the deal lacked transparency, and economists feared that sending hundreds of billions overseas could weaken Japan's already fragile fiscal balance. The nation's debt had reached historic highs, and critics argued that every dollar invested abroad was a dollar taken from domestic innovation. The backlash grew louder each week. Opposition lawmakers described the agreement as too generous, too vague, too risky. Within Japan's ruling party, confidence in Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba started to collapse. Approval ratings sank below 20%. His final decision, and to sign the US framework despite the warnings, became the breaking point. And then came the turning tide. A new leader rose with a simple promise: Japan would never trade its independence for approval. Her name was Sanae Takayichi, and within days of stepping into office, she would turn the page on one of the most ambitious trade deals in modern history, and begin rewriting Japan's role in the global balance of power. When Sanae Takayichi stepped into power, the world took notice. Not because she was Japan's first female prime minister, but because of what she represented: a return to discipline, independence, and quiet strength. Her rise came at a time of chaos. Markets were uneasy, Tokyo was under pressure from Washington, and Ishiba's resignation had left a void. But Takayichi didn't step in as a caretaker. She arrived as a force of clarity. In her first televised address, she spoke with a calm authority that instantly shifted Japan's tone. No partnership should require us to surrender our judgment. Our cooperation must be built on equality, not fear. Those words electrified the nation. The stock market steadied. Approval ratings surged. Newspapers called it the conservative reset. Her leadership style mirrored that of her mentor, the late Shinzo Abe: pragmatic, strategic, and deeply protective of Japan's sovereignty. Behind closed doors, Takayichi's cabinet began a quiet review of every clause in the US framework. Lawyers found gaps, economists spotted inconsistencies, and within weeks, a new plan emerged, one that would keep Japan's promised investments under Tokyo's full supervision through its state-backed bank. Washington called it unexpected, but for Japan, it was a moment of quiet pride. The country wasn't walking away from its allies, it was walking toward balance. Her supporters described her as the woman who turned hesitation into resolve. And her critics, even those in the opposition, admitted one thing: she had restored something money couldn't buy: respect. But Takayichi's boldness came with a price. Because the moment Japan took back control, the ripple hit Wall Street, and the world economy felt it overnight. The moment Japan took back control, the markets trembled. It started quietly, a flicker in the yen's value, a cautious drop in US defense stocks, a sudden pause in investor confidence. Then, like dominoes, everything began to move. Within 24 hours, billions shifted across currencies, as traders tried to read what Tokyo's decision truly meant. For Wall Street, it was more than an economic setback. It was a psychological one. The $550 billion that once looked guaranteed now seemed untouchable. Bloomberg described the scene as the sharpest correction of expectations since Brexit. Major US contractors who had celebrated new defense and energy deals saw their shares fall nearly 6%. Energy executives who had planned expansions in Alaska and the Gulf Coast were suddenly uncertain. Meanwhile, inside Tokyo, something remarkable happened. Instead of panic, there was applause. The Japanese public, long accustomed to following Washington's lead, saw Takayichi's move as an act of national confidence. Social media flooded with messages of support. Business journals called it a quiet revolution in policy thinking. The world began to sense a pattern. Japan wasn't rebelling, it was resetting. And that subtle distinction changed everything. Because as analysts scrambled to understand the implications, other capitals were watching closely. Seoul, Taipei, Singapore, even Canberra. If Japan, the most loyal US ally in Asia, could redraw the rules, then maybe others could too. The markets had just witnessed a shock. But what was coming next would be far bigger than finance. It would be political, strategic, and deeply symbolic. When Japan moved, Asia listened. Only days after Tokyo's announcement, meetings behind closed doors began to multiply. In Seoul, in Taipei, in Singapore. Leaders and ministers watched the market's reaction and asked themselves a question no one had dared to before. If Japan can say no, why can't we? South Korea was the first to respond. Just months earlier, it had signed a similar framework, $350 billion in pledged investment in exchange for tariff relief. But after Japan's defiance, Seoul's tone shifted. Its national security advisor calmly told reporters, "Our commitments must reflect mutual benefit." Behind those words was a quiet refusal. Seoul had no intention of transferring funds without transparency. In Taipei, lawmakers demanded a full review of trade exposure to the United States, citing the Japan precedent. In Singapore, senior economists called for a more balanced structure of partnership. Even Australia began reassessing its long-term energy contracts. Across Asia, the message was clear. The era of unquestioned compliance was ending. And it wasn't rebellion, it was evolution. For decades, Washington had built its leadership on predictability, allies who would follow its lead, markets that would align with its direction. But now that rhythm was breaking. Each capital was beginning to find its own tempo, its own definition of cooperation. From a distance, the shift looked subtle. Policy tweaks, cautious statements, diplomatic courtesy. But beneath the surface, the Pacific was changing shape. And by the time Washington realized the scale of it, the tide had already turned. The next move, however, would come not from Asia, but from the heart of the White House itself. In Washington, patience was running out. What began as a diplomatic surprise was now a strategic headache. The White House had counted on Japan's $550 billion to fuel its industrial comeback, a model it hoped to replicate across Asia. But with Tokyo's hesitation spreading like wildfire, America needed a new plan. Fast. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, the architect of the original framework, stepped forward with a bold idea: the creation of a new U.S. Investment Accelerator, a federal office designed to control and direct all incoming allied capital. Its mission was clear: ensure that every dollar aligned with America's national priorities. Energy terminals in Alaska, semiconductor plants in the Midwest, naval infrastructure along the Pacific coast. The blueprint sounded visionary, but it came with one critical catch. Foreign governments would have only 45 days to review U.S. project proposals and no voting power in how the money was spent. In Tokyo, that clause landed like a thunderclap. For Prime Minister Takayichi, it wasn't just a procedural issue, it was a question of sovereignty. She reminded reporters that Japan's contributions must respect our fiscal independence and national accountability. To investors, her message was clear: Japan would decide the pace, volume, and direction of its disbursements on its own terms. Back in Washington, officials worried that Japan might stall indefinitely. Some hinted at the return of higher tariffs if Tokyo delayed, but confidence was fading. Even American analysts warned that another trade confrontation could shake the markets again. As one industry executive told the Financial Times, "We wanted partnership, not a new economic cold front." The alliance that once defined stability was now standing at a crossroads, and the next move would determine more than trade. It would decide who truly led the Pacific century. In the end, Japan didn't shout. It simply stood its ground, quietly, firmly, and with precision. Under Prime Minister Takayichi, Tokyo's strategy became a masterclass in subtle power. There were no ultimatums, no fiery speeches, just control through calm discipline. The Japan Bank for International Cooperation began managing every dollar of the pledged capital internally, converting what once looked like a foreign commitment into a domestic mechanism for selective engagement. To the outside world, it seemed bureaucratic. But to those watching closely, it was revolutionary. This was not defiance, it was evolution. For decades, Japan had been seen as a loyal extension of the Western economic system. Yet, in 2025, it quietly redefined partnership on its own terms. Collaboration, yes, but with autonomy intact. The ripple effect spread far beyond Tokyo. Asian economists began referring to it as the Quiet Revolution, a shift from dependency to equilibrium. Across the region, nations started prioritizing self-determination in trade, investing in local industries, and diversifying global alliances. For Washington, the message was unmistakable. Influence built on expectation had met a new form of diplomacy, one grounded in choice. And in the corridors of finance and power, a realization dawned. The old formula no longer worked. Every generation has its turning point. For the Pacific, it wasn't marked by war or confrontation, but by something far more enduring: the return of balance. As currencies steadied and markets adjusted, the real shift was already underway, not in numbers, but in mindset. Because sometimes revolutions don't need noise, they just need conviction. Every era has a moment when power quietly changes hands, not through conflict, but through choice. For decades, the world assumed that Washington's word would always shape the global economy. But in 2025, one calm decision from Tokyo proved otherwise. Japan's quiet defiance wasn't rebellion, it was a reminder that respect is the true currency of alliances. And as the Pacific adjusted to this new reality, a deeper truth emerged. Influence cannot be demanded, it must be earned. Across Asia, leaders began speaking of balance instead of obedience, of partnership instead of pressure. The age of unilateral dominance was fading, replaced by a more complex but more stable order, one built on mutual benefit and shared accountability. For America, this was not the end of leadership, but the beginning of adaptation. For Japan, it was the moment it redefined strength, not as submission, but as steadiness. And for the world watching, it marked something larger than a trade story. It marked the first page of a new chapter, one that might just be called the Asian Century. Because sometimes history doesn't announce itself with thunder. It begins with silence and a single word: no. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who love exploring the hidden forces shaping our world. And tell us in the comments, do you think the balance of global power has already begun to shift? We'll see you in the next episode, where we uncover how today's quiet moves are rewriting tomorrow's empires.